In this lesson, we take a look at V-Ray hair material or hair MTL, and this material is used for hair and fur rendering. Also, we'll be discussing V-Ray HairInfoTexture, which is a very useful map to control different attributes of the hair material. Obviously, there are numerous ways of generating hair, including 3ds Max's hair and fur modifier, V-Ray Fur, and plugins like Ornatrix or Hair Farm. And the good thing is V-Ray supports both the native hair and fur modifier and these two popular third-party plugins via V-Ray Hair Farm modifier and V-Ray Ornatrix modifier. In the scene, you notice we have this pillow and there is a hair and fur modifier applied to it to generate the hair strands. In its settings, you can see we have about 100,000 hair strands, and in the material parameters, I have tip fade off, which is going to help us visualize our hair material a bit better. The next important thing in rendering hair with V-Ray is to go to the environment and effects window by pressing 8 on your keyboard. And in the effects tab, select the hair and fur effects and make sure the hair type is set to men tolerate primitive. Now let's open up our material editor and add a new hair material to the active shade. In order to assign V-Ray hair material to your hair, you need to select the hair and fur modifier, and in the MR parameters rollout, enable apply MR shader and simply drag your material in this empty slot as an instance. Now the hair material is applied. Also, we need to apply a material to the pillow itself, so let's create a new V-Ray material. Set its diffuse value to something like maybe 18 and assign it to the pillow. You can adjust the diffuse color based on the hair that you are trying to create. For example, if you are trying to create a red hair, you need to kind of change the diffuse color based on that for the base material for the pillow, right? But in this case, we're going to just leave it like that, and I wouldn't change it for different hair looks, but you're gonna need to do that based on the hair color that you are trying to achieve, and try to change the diffuse color for the pillow material as well. Hair material has three main components: a primary specular component, a secondary specular component, and a transmission component. Also, we have a diffuse layer or component, which is not essential in order to render hair, but it can be used in rendering materials made up of cloth threads or other non-translucent fibers, or add dirt to the hair strands and stuff like that. Now, if you take a look at this image, which this gray circle represents a single hair strand in it, the primary specular component represents light that is reflected off the outer surface of a hair strand. The secondary specular component represents light that goes through the hair strand and is reflected off the back surface. And the transmission component represents light that goes through the hair strand and basically scatters. Now let's explain all the parameters in the hair material, and for me the first thing to do is to make sure to find a way that ensures the hair strands are going to get more transparent as they go from the root to the tip. And this is possible by using the opacity parameter, and this parameter basically controls whether the hair is transparent or opaque. If it's white, and by default it is, the hairs are gonna be opaque, and if it's set to black, they are gonna be transparent. But we want to map this transparency along the hair strand in such a way that the root of the hair is gonna be fully opaque, and as we go along and get closer to the tip, it becomes more and more transparent, and it can simply be done by using V-Ray HairInfoTexture as the opacity map. So let's add a V-Ray HairInfoTexture. and connect it to the opacity texture. Right now, the output of this map is set to position along strands. Basically, the map is outputting color A and color B, which are black and white, along the strand. As you can see from the hair material preview, the white color making the roots opaque and the black color makes the tip transparent, and the grayscale value will be applied along the strand. Also, we have this bias value which lets us to control where along the strand transparency happens, how this transition from opaque to transparent is going to happen. So if I set it to something like 0.1, you can see the transition between opaque and transparent parts happens very early along the hair strand, and as I increase the bias value, it happens closer to the tip of the hair. Now, for now, let's set it to the default of 0.5 and get back to our hair material. In the General Parameters tab, first we have Preset dropdown. This allows you to choose different hair presets, including white shiny and matte, blonde shiny and matte, red shiny and matte, brown shiny and matte, and finally black shiny and matte. Now let's take a look at a few presets and see how they look. So you simply set the preset to whatever hair color you want and simply render the scene. It's that simple. The renders were done in progressive sampler for about 4 minutes, therefore there is going to be artifacts and noise. The first render was done with the white matte preset, then we have white shiny, we have red matte, red shiny, and you can see some artifacts in this one due to the lack of proper sampling, and we simply need more time to render the scene to get a scene without any artifacts. And I think in this case probably the bucket sampler is going to do a better job sampling these very thin strands, but we see that. Finally, we have black matte and black shiny. I didn't render brown and blonde presets, but you can check that out on your own time. For now, let's get back to the hair material and set the preset to white shiny. Overall multiplier is a common color multiplier for all color components in the material except for opacity. It is used to easily change the look of the entire hair material. So let's try a purplish color like 47. 10 and 17 and see how it changes the look of the hair. As you can see, by simply changing the overall multiplier color, we can control the entire look of the hair. Now let's set the overall multiplier color to its default value, which is a white color with the value of 230. We talked about opacity already. In the diffuse rollout, we can control the diffuse component of the hair. Normally, clean hair doesn't require any diffuse contribution, but as I mentioned earlier, you can use this component for material made out of cloth threads or other non-translucent fibers. We have the diffuse color, which specifies the color of the diffuse component, and diffuse amount, which is the amount of the diffuse component. For the diffuse color, let's use the same purple color that we use for the overall multiplier color. So 47, 10, and 17. And now let's see a few renders. In the first render, diffuse amount is 0, so we only get speculars and transmission components. In the next one, diffuse amount is 0.5, and finally 1. There you have it. You can see how the diffuse adds up to the material. Now let's set the diffuse color to black and diffuse amount to 0. Also, let's change the preset from white shiny to red shiny. Next, we have our primary specular component, which corresponds to light that is reflected off the outer surface of hair strand, as I mentioned earlier. Also, the primary specular component is supposed to be shinier compared to the secondary specular component, as you can see from their glossiness values. We have primary specular color, which is the color of the primary specular component, and it's usually dark gray no matter what is the hair color that you might be trying to achieve. Primary specular amount is a multiplier for specular color, and obviously higher values will result in shinier and more reflective hairs. We have primary glossiness, which controls how sharp or matte the hair looks. Higher values result in shinier looks, and lower values will result in more matte looks. The secondary specular component corresponds to light that is reflected off the back surface of the hair strand. The parameters are almost identical to the primary specular component. We only have this extra option called lock to transmission. When enabled, which is the default state, the color and amount for the specular and for the secondary specular component is derived from the color of the transmission component. Since a ray of light goes twice through the hair width, the color of the secondary specular components can be computed by multiplying the transmission color with itself. When this option is enabled, the hair color, the overall, the general, the main hair color is mostly determined by the transmission color component. Now let's explore a few renders with different values for primary and secondary specular components. First, let's try working with the glossiness values. In the first render, primary glossiness was set to 0.8 and secondary glossiness was set to 0.7, and we get a very matte look. In the second render, primary glossiness was set to 0.9 and secondary glossiness was set to 0.8. Now we see a bit more shinier, maybe a reflection. In the final render, primary glossiness was set to 0.98 and secondary glossiness was set to 0.9. Now we get much sharper, stronger reflection. Let's leave it at 0.98 and 0.9 for now. Next, we have our transmission component rollout. The transmission component corresponds to light that goes through the hair strands and scatters. Transmission color specifies the color for the transmission component, and as mentioned earlier, if the lock to transmission is enabled in the secondary specular rollout, transmission color is the dominant color of the hair. If you focus on the transmission color as I go through different presets, you can see the only color that is changing in the entire material is the transmission color, and also because lock to transmission color is enabled in the secondary specular rollout, the color of the secondary specular color is also changing based on the transmission color. Now let's set the preset to red shiny again. The secondary specular color is simply the result of a simple multiplication of the transmission color by itself. It's actually very simple to prove that point. Let's just quickly do that. Add a composite map. Make sure you have 2 layers. Add a V-Ray color map. Now let's copy the transmission color and use it as the color for the V-Ray color map. Now connect this map to the both layer 1 and 2 of the composite map. And set the second layer's blending mode to multiply. And now you can see the resulting color is the exact color that we have in the secondary specular color. Now let me delete these maps for now. Transmission amount specifies the amount of the transmission component. In the first render, transmission amount was 0. We only get primary specular component and no transmission or secondary specular component. In the next render, it was set to 0.5, then 1, and finally 2. Let's set the transmission amounts back to 1 here. We have transmission glossiness, length, and width, which specify the glossiness of the transmission along the hair strand length and width. It's a bit hard to visualize these two parameters on the hair model that we have here. You need a light source behind the strands to see the effect of these parameters a bit better. But normally these parameters change the way light scatters along the length and the width of the strands. Higher values for the length glossiness compresses the transmission highlight along the strand length, while lower values expand it. Finally, we have our options rollout. Opaque for shadow makes the hair opaque for shadow calculations, and in this case we are using a map to make our hair strands transparent, right? Having this option on can speed up the render but would reduce the overall accuracy of the render. Now let me show you two renders with opaque foreshadows on and off. In the first render, it's off and we get our normal render. And in the second render, it's on. And now, because the shadow rays consider the hair strands to be fully opaque, we get different looking shadows. And if I compare it to the previous render, you can see this difference very clearly. Let me zoom in maybe a bit to see that effect a bit better. Also, another thing I want you to notice is even though both of these two renders were rendered for 4 minutes, the one with opaque foreshadows on is a lot cleaner. Therefore, it's going to be a lot faster if you render your hair with this option on, if you don't mind the difference in the look. For now, let's turn off opaque foreshadows. We have opaque for GI, and when enabled, the hair material is always considered opaque for GI calculations, and this speed up the rendering also for transparent hairs. In the first render, opaque for GI was disabled, and in the second one it was enabled. When this option is on, GI considers the hair strands to be opaque. You can see the visual difference between the two render, and the second one is also cleaner compared to first. And if I zoom in and compare it to, you can see this. And that simply means having this option on is going to speed up your renders as well. Now let me disable opaque for GI for now. We have simplify for GI. When enabled, a simplified diffuse version of the BRDF is used for GI calculations. This may speed up the rendering of hair but may significantly change the final look. In the first render, simplify for GI is on, and in the second one, it is off. Let's turn it on for now. We have use cached GI. This option is similar to the use irradiance map option for the V-Ray material. If it is disabled, the hair material will always be calculated with brute force GI. Right now it's enabled, but as we have brute force defined as our primary render engine, brute force is going to be used. In the maps rollouts, you can map different parameters obviously. And in the advanced rollouts, we have light multiplier, and this one specifies a multiplier for the effects of direct illumination on the current material. And we can take a look at a few renders. In the first one, light multiplier is set to 0, so as you can see, there is no direct illumination. We have then 0.5, 1, and finally 2. For now, let's make sure light multiplier is set to 1. Before closing this lesson, I think we need to discuss V-Ray hair info texture in detail, as it is such an important and useful map in conjunction with hair material. Right now we are using this map to control the transparency along the hair strands. Let's create a new hair info texture map and see what we get. Using this map, you can control different shading properties along hair strands or among individual hair strands. First, we have output, which specifies how this color A and B are blended together. We have position along strand, and it blends between color A and color B based on the position of the shaded point along a hair strand. The color A parameter is used at the root of the strand, and the color B parameter is used at the tip. But based on your setup, this can be reversed. We have random by strand index, and this one blends between color A and color B randomly based on the index of each strand. This mode only works for hair and fur and V-Ray or Natrix modifier geometry, but not for V-Ray fur at the moment. Hair and fur color and alembic color, and this mode works only for hair and fur geometry and alembic geometries, and the resulting color is taken from the diffuse color of the hair and fur modifier, or your alembic model obviously. Hair and fur transparency, this mode works only for hair and fur geometry, and the resulting color is taken from the transparency of the hair and fur modifier. Color A is the first color used when output is positioned along strand or random by strand index. You can use a map to control this color. Color B is the second color used when output is positioned along strand or random by strand index. We have bias, and it can be used to move the middle point between the two colors when output is positioned along strand or random by strand index. And we have seed offset, and this is the random seed when output is random by strand index. Let's try a few things with this texture. The first thing would be to use the defined colors in the hair and fur modifier as the main colors for our hair material. So the way you do that is very simple. First, select the hair info map and set its output to hair and fur alembic color. Now use this map as the transmission color. Select the hair and fur modifier, and in the material parameters rollout, change the root color. Let's maybe try a green color like 31, 99, and 24. We can use the same color for the tip color as well. Also, let's change the mutant color to something like 20%, so we get some random white hair strands here and there. Now, if you render the scene with the current settings, you can see the result in render 01, and as you can see, those color from hair and fur modifier has been translated literally in our render. Another interesting thing you can do is to make the individual hair strands to have different colors, and this can be done using random by strand index. So let's set the output to that mode. For color A, let's use a white color with the value of 230, and for color B, let's use the same green color from the hair and fur modifier. Right now, because the bias value is set to 0.5, 50% of the total hair strands will be white and the other 50 will be green. Using the bias value, I can change that percentage. If I go to something like 0.1, now we are gonna get 90% white and 10% green. And if I set it to something like 0.95, now we get more green hairs. So let's see what the render is gonna look right now. And the result would be render 02. Obviously, if you wanted to separately control the root and the tip color, okay, simply set the output mode to position along the strand, define the root and the tip color using color A and B, and define where you want the transition between those two colors to happen using the bias value. I think that would be enough. Let me just show you a final render. And it's gonna take a long time, especially when the entire hair material is the main subject and it takes that much screen space, but it's gonna take a long time to render. Now, as you can see, we get a beautiful render, nice realistic hairs using V-Ray hair material. Perfect. In this lesson, we learned about V-Ray hair material and V-Ray hair info texture. Hopefully you learned something, and I will see you in the next lesson.